If you want to find out what are the best decks post Age of Overlord, see what did well at YCS Indy and Santa Cruz, make sure to check out this video and stay to the end if you want to find out how to get deck lists for 19 different topping decks from YCS Indy, all free to download.
It's time to do.
Hey everyone, this is Max and MaxCTCG. Thanks for joining me in another video. So what we're going to do is a tier list video for post Age of Overlord after YCS Indy, which I went to and was a lot of fun. And what we're going to do for this series of tier list is, instead of doing a super large tier list that we'll do at the beginning of formats when everything's kind of shaping out, when we have big events or sets that change the format, what we're going to do is look at the cards that are in those sets, see what's prevalent, and then look at decks that were expected to do well or did well at the tournament. Just kind of focusing on really what's changed, because a lot of the lower tier decks really haven't moved much unless they got any support. For the Age of Overlord set, and talk about how they've really changed the game. Two that are very generic that really have affected the game is SP Little Knight and Typhon. So SP Little Knight is definitely the one that everyone was expecting to be really huge and really did, get a lot of play in the format. We've seen it in Rescue Ace, pretty much any deck that can summon Link 2s without need locking restrictions is going to play this card for sure. It's an amazing card, really replaced Nightmare Unicorn, allowing you to banish a card on summon when you use an extra deck monster to summon it, as well as being able to tag out 2 monsters on the field, banishing them to the end phase, allowing you to protect your own monsters from being Nibiru'd or destroyed, or removing that monster and an opponent's monster to try to hinder their plays. So being a 2 for 1 interruption, being able to dodge effect negation that targets it when it hits the field. You have 2 cards to remove, so just a really great card. I think Typhon people were kind of sleeping on a little bit. I think people knew the card was good, but thought it would only be good in certain decks. But I think really just as a going second card, it's just an amazing way to push through boards, really turn off a lot of the kind of 3000 or higher Omni Negate monsters. Be really good against Mid-Adium with their Baron and Bestial Despoter setup that they use. So again, a really great card and can be really useful in a lot of matchups, and I think a lot of decks should be playing it as long as you don't lock yourself out of being able to summon the card, because it's super generic and really easy to be able to play. Some other engines that came out that really did affect the game is the Diabellstar and Sinful Spoils package. Really great for being able to summon any level 1 fires, which is huge in Rescue Ace, really giving it a lot of consistency. Was a big reason why I think Rescue Ace had so much representation at this tournament, as well as being a very safe pick for the tournament, since the format is really diverse on there being a lot of decks that you can play at the tier 1, tier 1.5 level, and even do well with a lot of tier 2 decks. Another two really big hitters that we had was Gen and Ken. I think they're a little overhyped on what they can do. I think on paper they're really good, being able to work really well with Thrust and Talents, Change of Heart. These cards that are generally only good going second, but now can also be played going first, because you're forcing your opponent to have a monster that activates on their field, allowing you to activate those cards, ripping cards from hand, stealing them to use their effect to summon another monster. People suspected this would be really good in Dark World. Some people thought about playing it in Pearly. I think we saw a really interesting kind of design with it being used in Makanko, which was doing pretty well at YCS Indy and also ended up winning YCS Santa Cruz. So that might be a new deck we have to look out for. And again, really great cards, but I don't think as broken as people thought they might be on paper. We also have the Horus engine, which is pretty big, pretty interesting engine, but I think can have some issues with consistency and having to be paired with the right cards. We've seen it with a Bestial Horus engine at YCS NG, which is really cool, and as well as in some Tearlament decks, like Phantom Knight deck that made day 2, and a few other interesting Horus designs. Another deck we saw that got a lot of really good support was Mid-Adium, with Visa Samsara being another card for being able to facilitate 1-card combos for them to be able to play, as well as Mid-Adium Trisukta, another great synchro option for them to be able to go to, again making more 1-card plays. or you can use multiple tuners to make it. So another really good card that I think made Vanadium a really great deck to choose for the tournament and probably for the format going forward. And then we have the new Chimera fusion, Baphomet, the Mythical King of Phantom Beasts. A really cool fusion that lets you send a Fiend, Beast, or Illusion monster from your deck to the grave. And then you can use your other Chimera fusion to actually banish that during your opponent's turn and to special summon that Fiend back. It's a really great way to create a lock. You can use it to summon the Illusion Magician, which is originally more just like a brick built to play. Now it's a little bit better. You could play the End of Anubis for tier limit. You just gotta be able to protect it so it can stay on the field. You also can end up playing cards like King Tiger Wanghu for Pearly monsters or low-level sprite monsters. You play Invader of Darkness for Runic and really quick play spells potentially. So there are some really interesting options for this card. That's a really great part for the Chimera deck to have now. We had the Angelica's Angelic Ring, something really nice in Infernoble, allowing them to negate the first spell card activated, and even be able to negate cards that normally can't be negated, like Dark Ruler and Super Poly. It's another really good card for those strategies. We also saw Labyrinth get a card in Arius, the Labyrinth Butler. It's another card that could be really solid. You can send it to the grave and be able to set a Labyrinth or special summon a Labyrinth monster. And if it's a trap, you can activate it that turn. Another nice way to kind of get the deck started and give it a little bit more speed. We also saw Vanquish Soul get some support in Jiaolong and a trap card, Vanquish Soul Snow Devil. Again, I think gave Vanquish Soul a little bit more power. Jiaolong is meant to give the deck a little more consistency with getting Raisin. Problem is you kind of need multiple fires to pull it off, because when the deck has Raisin, it is really solid. But still a great addition to the deck, and we'll probably be placing Pluto in the deck. As well as the trap card, which I didn't think was going to see some play, but the topping deck profile for Vanquish Soul, or at least the day 2 deck profile, was playing it and did like the card, so we might see that become more standard in Vanquish Soul. We also had some cards that could be interesting but didn't really do anything yet. We have Exceed the Pendulum, another really good kind of Beyond the Pendulum kind of counterpart that could be helpful for Pendulum decks. We got some support for Shino Birds, for Watts, TG, Snake Eye, decks that really haven't seen a lot of meta potential or like meta success yet, but might have some potential. I think mostly with Snake Eye in the future and maybe TG, an interesting combo deck, but can really struggle with choke points from hand traps, especially more than other combo decks in the format. Alright, so that just covers kind of all the cards that came out in Age of Overlord and how they've really affected the game, and maybe have shifted what decks are going to be doing better now that we have these cards. So next we'll just kind of go over the tier list real quick. I did a more in-depth version of this in the last tier list video, but we're just going to do this a little quicker. If you are newer to the game and you want a more in-depth breakdown of how to understand how the tiers work, I can either make a separate video or you can check out the first video. There's a timestamp for it. So tier 0 decks, these are really the kind of meant to be the best decks in the format, usually 67% representation, largest deck in top cut by a mile, and you pretty much have to play this deck or play a deck that hard counters this deck, or you will not be able to really play in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier 1 decks are going to be the decks that have the strongest engines, generally are going to be able to play through the most cards, be the most resilient, have the most consistency. They're going to be, when you compare that engine to another engine in the game, it's going to be the one you want to play, just because it's generally stronger, but is a little bit more targeted. Tier 1.5 are decks that are kind of on the edge of maybe being tier 1 or tier 2. It kind of depends. I think a lot of these decks depend more on matchup because their engines aren't as strong as tier 1 to make them kind of generally stronger all the time, but it can kind of ebb and flow out of the format based off which decks are doing well, or if they get new support, or if they're still being figured out. Tier 2 are going to be solid picks overall, can be played at a high level in local and regionals, but you have to be pretty good with the deck and have some good matchups. Tier 3 are decks that I think really need a specific meta call to be played. Can do well if you're a really good player, but it's something that your engine is not going to be as strong, and you're really focusing on those matchups and meta calls for that deck to be a good pick. And then you have tier 4, the decks you really probably shouldn't be playing at a high level and really only be picking for local level events, just because the engines and what the deck does just isn't strong enough to compete. Right, so what we'll do is dive into the decks and see how they rank. So you have Sinful Spoils, Rescue Ace. I think we're seeing this now in tier 1 for sure. I had it in tier 1.5 when it was just Rescue Ace. So that one up here as well. I still think the Sinful Spoils deck is the way to go, but again, I'm going to be a good amount of money to include to get those cards. They're playing SP, the Belsar, and Sinful Spoils package. I think just kind of those cards alone can increase the deck cost by like $500. So it can be pretty pricey. I think if you are just playing standard Rescue Ace, you still have a decent deck, but you're going to be really missing the consistency and resilience that the Sinful Spoils cards add to the game, and we did see like a 37% representation in Top Cut for YCS Indie. It was definitely a really represented deck on the floor. Alright, next we're going to look at Pearly, the second most represented deck in Top Cut. So still a really solid deck, can have issues in time if you're not using cards to be able to help you with that, just because My Friend is such an integral part to be able to play with the deck, but then makes you lose life points. So I think people really need to be playing the Dark Lord package or a way to mitigate the life point loss when playing this deck to be able to do well in a longer tournament. Next we'll go to probably the third most represented deck. I'm going to put this with Danger Tier Limit. I do think this is probably the best version, but there are multiple tier limit versions that we'll kind of talk about briefly for each of them. The reason why I like the Danger Tier Limit one the most is I think it's the most consistent, and at least for me, I think consistency is really important for when I want to play a deck. I generally want to choose a deck that's a little more consistent than a deck that has a higher ceiling, but can't play as well. The Danger cards just seem to be nice because you overall better mills. The Dangers can remove cards from hand, triggering them to draw cards and get bodies. You can still avoid Nib with cards like Bahamut Shark to get the Totally Awesome. So I think it still has a lot of really good plays and is a really solid deck to choose. Can still be a little high rolly. I don't think I'd personally play tier, but it did do well in the tournament and was on the floor a lot. And we'll talk about the other tier limit decks when we get into tier 1.5 because I think they're a little worse, but still solid choices. And then we'll look at the last deck. So I think we have Unchained. So a really kind of big change from the kind of last tier list being probably the most represented deck in the game before, but now we're really seeing that it kind of dropped off. I think it does have some consistency issues still. There's a lot of 1-ofs you don't really want to draw. A hard deck to play, but still a really solid deck. Did get top 8 by a really good player, Cameron Neal, so can definitely still do well in the tournament scene. Is very resilient, but we did see a pretty steep drop off from where it was just a few weeks ago in terms of its representation and its conversion into Top Cut. All right, next I think we're going to see Mannadium. So Mannadium is going to be tier 1.5. I don't think it's exactly in tier 1, but I think it's on the verge of it. Got a lot of really good cards with the set release we went over. I think it's become, being able to play more as a 1-card combo deck versus 2. I think Triff had a really interesting build that was a little more mid-range focus. More going second cards, not having to make the super crazy board, being more consistent, being able to play through cards more. So I think that build might be the way to go moving forward versus kind of the way the deck I think has more been played up to this point. The deck still really does hard lose to Joel to some extent. I guess saying hard lose isn't fair. It can still play through Droll. It definitely won't be able to play as much. And good players, especially in game 2 and 3 when the side deck's involved, since not everyone might be maining Droll, just due to the diversity of the format, will probably play around Droll by trying to get the best card they can, so they don't play into it as much and still be able to make a board. So next we have Branded Chimera. I still think this is a tier 1.5 deck. I think it's still really good. The plays it can make it really strong. It has targeting protection in the grid with a lot of its monsters. The locks that it can pull off now with the new Chimera Fusion, I think can really help the deck. It can play a lot of tech slots, which is really nice. I think one thing that can hurt it is that I think Shifter can be pretty rough on the deck for not getting those protection and those cards being banished. You also can run into the issue of Droll potentially hurting the deck. If you start with Quotable or Prod of Prosperity, it can be really rough, just ending your turn since you don't get the Baphomet Fusion unless you hard to Chimera Fusion. So I think that could be pretty rough for the deck as well. So I think there can be some issues with the way it's lining up with certain cards. But overall, the ability to play a lot of tech slots with how consistent the deck is, I still think it's a really solid deck and can do well at events. Right, next we're going to get into the tier limit cards. for the other variants. So we're going to start with the Tearlament King of the Swamp variant. Some people might see the abbreviation as KOTS. This is kind of the more standard version of Tearlament before we got into Danger Tearlament from Gabriel Netz at YCS Dortmund. But the King of the Swamp version, I think the issue with it is just the King of the Swamp cards aren't as, they're not as great to mill, which is why people lean more towards the Danger variant. But you do get the option for Rakalos and Bahamut Shark and Toad, so more ways to play through Nib and make boards. The King of the Swamp can be nice for being able to make the Poly and Guardian Chimera play for going second and giving you an untargetable monster, with there being a lot of targeting in the format. So there still could be some warrant for this version, and it's not bad. It did get top 32. The Horse Tearlament deck, I think, is pretty interesting because it does give you some aspects that the other decks don't, in terms of being able to make more bodies, that are level 8, and going to rank 8 plays, potentially being able to play through Nib with the Photon Lord, being able to better play through Dweller by being able to get these bodies onto the field. But I think you do run into the issue that they're not great mills, so you are kind of playing a little bit more of a high roll deck with a deck that's already kind of more high roll based, since it's kind of based off the cards you mill, but did have a good showing in its feature match. I think it does have potential in the format, and I think especially once Horse gets more cards to make it more consistent, we might see this version become more prevalent. We'll move Rescue Ace over here because I think that's kind of where it's sitting over with these decks here. We have Dragon Link, did do well, at the tournament relatively, did make day 2. I think one of the issues with Dragon Link is it really does suffer from Droll, especially going second. If they Droll you, it's really hard to push with the deck. We are seeing Shifter still by decks that can play it and trying to hard counter Tearlaments. So again, kind of puts Dragon Link in the crossfire. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're not seeing Dragon Link do as well, but still a very solid deck for players that are good at playing it. Alright, next we have the Labyrinth decks. We're going to do Furniture Labyrinth. So this did top YCS Indie at top 32. I think with the fact that Unchained's not seeing as much representation, I think the Furniture version is doing better now. And with RES giving a little bit more steam, I think that could definitely help the deck. I think it still is on paper a really solid deck. I think it's still warranted in tier 1.5. I think the issue just as a trap deck, it is a little bit slower, but it's definitely a scary deck. So next we're going to go into Trap Labyrinth. So Trap Labyrinth is something we saw at YCS Dortmund, some really interesting innovations. We didn't really see it at this tournament, but still I think a solid deck. I think was a really good pick for the way it was built when Unchained was super dominant, since they did have a hard time with that deck, being able to play the Heavenly Lord to be able to stop destruction, set trap cards, be able to play Runic as an interesting engine to out Caesar, protect yourself from destruction with Hugin. So I think still a deck that can absolutely see play in this format, but I do personally like the Furniture version better overall. But again, a really interesting kind of version to swap between depending on where you're kind of thinking the meta is going to go. Right, and that covers all of our tier 1.5 decks, and we'll move into tier 2. So next here for tier 2, we have Infernoble. I think a really solid deck, especially with the Angelica's Angelic Ring. I think this does make the deck pretty scary. I do like that going first. It has the Neospacer Dolphin combo that can try to tear hand traps out of the opponent's hand. And I think it is a really solid deck. 34th place, so barely missed top cut. So definitely could have seen that in the topping list. And I think definitely a deck you can play. Alright, so with Dark World, I do think this is another tier 2 deck. I think it's just can be such a scary deck going first, with being able to hand rip with having Getting Ken. You can use other cards to be able to try to play around Droll, Quickie Mirror monsters to negate monsters, citing second. Play the Virus cards, which can be very scary. You can thrust into those if you get drolled. So I think there's some really interesting ways to play this deck. Pretty hard, non-linear combo deck. I think it can be very scary and can be built relatively cheap as well. So I think that has a lot of things going for it, with a lot of its cards being in a structure deck. It does get hurt by Shifter, which is trying to hard counter Tearlament. Again, another deck kind of like Dragon Link that gets caught in the crossfire, and as well is hurt by Droll like Mannadium. So that's why I think it's worse than Mannadium and Dragon Link, but still a solid deck that can be very scary when piloted well. Next we have Floowandereeze. So this was a deck that was at tier 1.5 when Unchained was a very popular deck because it's such a good matchup. And again, this is one of those decks where I think tier 1.5 is really more matchup based to some extent with some of those decks. or the fact that the engine just isn't as formidable as the tier 1 decks and gets caught in kind of a weird counter. The deck is still having issues with consistency. I think Thrust is a great addition for the deck since it does lose just a troll. So thrusting your opponent, or using Droll like I did, and then getting thrusted for the Harpy's trap card to get monster effects is a great way to kind of give yourself a turn to play again. Still a good deck. I think due to Unchained not being as good, we're not going to see the deck do as well. We see Unchained start moving back up to the higher tier 1 status and being the most represented deck again. Then we'd see Flu go back up to tier 1.5. Alright, next we have Rika Sun Avalon. So I think this is a very solid deck. I think it's become a little bit more known again and on people's radar after winning another YCS in Europe for YCS Dortmund. Did top 32 YCS Indy. I think a lot of the issues is people just don't know how to play around the deck. But hopefully people start learning the deck and be able to learn to play through it. I don't like it as much as some of the other combo variants for the format, but if you are a really good player, I think the deck will do well. I think the deck struggles more in hand trap based formats, which we're going into, and I think we're going to see a lot more hand traps in general right now, especially due to Mannadium being countered more by hand traps and board breakers. Where I think Rika does a lot better in a board breaker format. So I think we're going to see that kind of limit its potential some, but still really good one card combo deck that can do some crazy stuff, has good abilities to play in time, so still a great pick for the format. Now we're going to look at the Runic deck. So I'm going to talk about Runic for Hire. I think it's really the only Runic deck worth talking about in overall representation. I did play a Orcish Runic deck, so if you're interested in that, let me know, I can make a profile on it. But I think it's the most represented out of the standard Runic variants with Live Twin Runic and For Hire Runic. I think the For Hire Runic version doesn't get countered as hard by Bystials and as the Live Twin version does, so I think that's one reason why it's doing a little bit better. I think the kind of popping of the deck and the consistency and explosion of it is really solid. Not as great of a matchup with Unchained, but again with a lot of Unchained kind of lowering itself, I think it's still a good pick. Well, the only Runic deck at the top is actually Runic Stun, that we'll talk about towards the end of tier 2. But I still think this is a solid pick. But I think with the format being so diverse, Runic decks aren't necessarily a bad pick, but we just didn't see them convert at YCS Indy. Right, so next we have Vanquish Soul. So again, a pretty solid deck. I had it more in tier 3 before, but I do think with the new cards and how well we still see it doing pretty consistently topping events, I think even before I was probably underestimating it and it should have been more towards the bottom of tier 2. Now it's more mid tier 2. I think the new cards are interesting and can help out the deck. We could see it add a little bit more push to it for when it's playing due to Xiaolong being such a great card when you do have a hand that could really play it. And also, again, being able to play There Could Be Only One of the best floodgates in the format. Being able to play Shifter or DD Crow, depending on how you want to play the deck. Access to a lot of hand trap based play by drawing into them, which I think will be good this format that we're moving more into hand traps. So I think a lot of really great options for choosing Vanquish Soul, but again, still other decks that have stronger engines than this one. But I think a really cool deck. Next, we're going to go into some decks that didn't top, but I think are interesting and could do well moving forward. Phantom Knight Horus, I think, placed 66 or 68th in the tournament, made day 2. Again, I think just due to matchups, definitely could have still topped, just like Infernoble. I think it's an interesting version to play with Phantom Knights. Phantom Knights being able to discard them out of hand and get them in a grave. Being able to have another way to kind of play through Nib, which can be kind of hard for Phantom Knights, I think, at times, and one of its weaknesses. You do have the adventure side of it if you're playing that engine with it. You also have the ability to go into the rank 3 to be able to Nib, and this also gives the option to make Photon Lord for negating Nib in other plays as well. So a really solid deck overall. I think still in the tier 2 status because we haven't really seen it perform well enough. I think just due to matchups and tiebreakers, we could have seen this top. Next we have Bystial Horus, a really cool deck that we got to see on feature match, and I think winning its feature actually got it into top cut, which is really cool. Make it to top 16. Really interesting kind of combination of engines with using a small dragon link package mixed with resonators and Bystials and Horus, with the ability to summon really big kind of aggro style monsters, being able to kind of recycle some of the Red Dragon Archfiend monsters from the structure deck. It was really fun to see, definitely something I wasn't expecting. Pretty cool innovation here, and I think we'll see this become more popular for sure, especially at local on Tri-Brigade Sprite. So I do personally think this is the best sprite variant to go with going forward. Can play a lot of hand traps, really resilient to hand traps, really great use of SP, Omen's ability to banish off Revolt, be able to kind of play a more layered version of the game where you don't just get blown out by a Dark Ruler and cards that can be searched by Thrust that really do hurt sprite boards. I think has better options for follow-up. I think can potentially play cards like Ultimate Slayer due to having Garua and Bucephalus being able to work well in the engine. So I think it's a really solid deck and a great choice for people wanting to play Sprite this format. We also saw Adventure Sprite. Personally, I'm not as big of a fan of Adventure Sprite, but after seeing the deck profile, I did like it a lot more than I thought it was going to. I believe this also top 32 the event. Really interesting kind of combo lines in the way the different 2-card interactions work, and I think the deck was really well built. Has some really interesting aspects to it, being able to use the adventure cards going second and first, be able to make a lot of really interesting plays. Can do a lot with being able to use Mosquito for OTKs, which seems really solid. So again, I think another good version to use and probably my second pick for Sprite going into this format if that's something you want to play. Next we have Makanko. Now I think Makanko is interesting because at YCS Indy we did see it do well in the tournament, piloted by Deception, and probably close to topping, I believe. But then for YCS Santa Cruz, it actually won the event. I don't think it's a tier 1 deck, maybe tier 1.5 or higher tier 2. But just for now, I want to keep it more towards lower tier 2. I think tier 2 decks can still win events for sure. I think part of what maybe helped the Makanko deck was that people really didn't know how to play against it. They did see probably some stuff from YCS Indy and seeing how the deck works with the Acid Golem lock and be able to OTK going second. Now his plays going first. Can utilize Gen and Ken, which is really cool. Be able to really utilize the Thrust and Talent cards in the deck for first and second. So I think it is a scary deck because you don't want it to go first, you don't want it to go second. But I do wonder if some of the issues is more not understanding how to play against the deck versus the deck being really solid. Pretty much all 2-card combo, so it might run into some consistency issues, but overall still seems like a really solid deck, and I could definitely see it moving up the tier list further, even if we see somewhere up in here, maybe if we see it become more prevalent and more consistent other YCS level events and topping more regionals as well. For going second Sprite, I'm going to put it towards right now just a little bit higher than the Makanko at the moment. I think it's still a solid version to be able to play. I think going second decks tend to struggle more when people know they're going second, especially if you're winning dice rolls, which you don't want to do for going second deck. And I would play the other Sprite variants before this one. You can OTK with Mosquito, with a lot of the board breakers that the deck plays. But again, with this going more towards a hand trap format, I would definitely lean towards like Tri-Brigade Sprite and then Adventure Sprite, because I think Adventure Sprite can do what kind of going second Sprite is trying to do with OTKing, but I think has a little bit better time going first. And then we have Runic Stun. So I really don't like this deck. Asian Persuasion, Johnny that played the deck, called the deck Make No Friends deck. It's a solid deck, I think, just because Runic is good and stun cards are, just can be really brutal. Was ranked pretty high overall in the ranking for going into Top Cut, but only got top 32 at the event. But still amazing feat to be able to top the event in general. I don't think anyone really likes Runic Stun decks because it kind of does what everyone really hates about the deck, just banishing your deck, which can really hurt your deck building numbers. Banishing key cards can be huge. And then just kind of stalling out the games and just decking out your opponent isn't really fun. It's very solitary, not a lot of interaction. So I'm going to keep it towards the bottom of tier 2, partly because I don't want people playing it. And overall, I do think there are better decks than this one still, and I would probably still play other Runic variants above this one, but can do well at events, so we can't ignore that. Right, so next we're going to go into a couple tier 3 decks. So we saw Exo Sister top 8 the event. I think even with this performance, I maybe could see it tier 2, but I think it's still more tier 3 deck. I think part of it is the matchups, being able to play Shifter, decent going second with its ability, to use Magnifica for OTKing, nice Banish Interruptions for the deck. Can play certain floodgates like Gozen that can really hurt Vanadium, and certain decks like Unchained as well. I think it's a decent deck with solid matchups right now, but I do think it can get hurt by people potentially siding Kaijus or removal for the for Magnifica, since they gotta sit on that 1 Exceed monster to play, and are pretty reliant on Martha going through. So I don't think it's the best deck for the tournament. I think the player that did well with it made a good meta call, played well throughout the event, and was, being able to benefit from that. Next, we have Tenyi Swordsoul, again a deck that was actually doing quite well in the event from the features we saw. Can play decent hand traps, but I think right now just the engine is outclassed by the decks ahead of it, being just generally a deck that's said to be too fair, but a overall safe pick, good in time with the ability to burn, which I know there's a lot of draws at YCS Indy. So again, a solid pick, showed a pretty decent showing at the event, I think being 5-0 for the first 5 rounds, and winning on feature, I believe against Unchained. So, overall solid deck that you can play, but I do not think it's a deck that will win an event, but potentially top an event. And then the last deck we're going to go over for the tier list is the Exodia Pendulum FTK. This is really cool if you want to see the feature match where Exodia was summoned twice. I will link the feature match in the description of the video. If you're watching a short, just check out my link tree to go to the video to find that link. A really interesting version of Exodia that I haven't seen before. Instead of trying to deep draw Exodia deck, where you play a lot of draw cards to draw into it, you're actually using 2 warriors to make a sold, to be able to actually search all the pieces. You can do it very consistently, even potentially play through hand traps since they play a lot of extenders. So I think a solid deck for an FTK deck, but unfortunately just the deck can't really do much going second, just more or less trying to break negates and be able to play. And I think going into a heavy hand trap format, the deck can get, punished by Droll, by Ash, by, multiple hand trap disruptions, but was a cool deck to see. But again, I don't think it's more than a tier 4 deck. Again, kind of similar to Runic Stun, but I think doesn't have the consistency that Runic gives it to be able to play playable through multiple rounds and go second. These decks can be really scary going first, but not nearly as good when you can side for them and know how they work. And I think also probably caught people off guard with maybe not knowing how this version of the Pendulum kind of Exodia FTK worked, but was very fun to see. Alright, so that kind of goes over the tier list for post Age of Overlord. I hope that helps people that are trying to learn about the format and how these changes are happening. I think we might stabilize a little bit more now that we've had 2 YCS events kind of working off this list. It'll be interesting to see what happens moving forward. If you disagree with any of the kind of placement in the video or think there's decks I should have included, let me know in the comments. I could try to let you know what I think about those decks and where they might go. If you do want to test out any of the decks that are in this tier list, we have 19 topping decks from Age of Overlord, and I have the first place Akanko deck from Santa Cruz. If you want to download those, test those out, you can check out my link in the description. There'll be a website where you can download everything for free, no email required. You can put an email in if you want to be updated whenever I update the database for decks from topping events and different meta changes that we'll see throughout the format. So check that out if you want to stay up to date with that. All right, well, I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video, and I'll see you then.